Well, hello there. Welcome to the Pacific War channel, the channel where we cover the complete history of the Asia-Pacific War from 1937 to 1945.
必须要团结一致，消灭日本。
不对，你怎么？
And this is going to be our first episode on a film review. We're going to be reviewing The Opium War from 1997. So the Opium War was directed by Zi Jin and stars Bao Guan, Lin Liankun, Xi Honglong, Bob Peck, Simon Williams, Zhuao Hixin, Su Min, and the film was shot in Hengxian World Studios in Zhejiang province of China. And I apologize for my pronunciation of names and places. I'm learning as we go along. So as per the title, the film is about the First Opium War of 1839 to 1842. If you've not already seen my episode on the First Opium War, please click on the card above. Warning, this is of course going to be a spoiler-filled review. The movie came out in 1997, so, you've been warned. Now before I get into the review, I would like to make one thing clear. Historic film reviews usually are built upon looking at the historical accuracy of the film. However, for certain films, this is a bit complicated. The First Opium War lasted 3 years, and countless battles occurred. In the film, they condense most of these events immensely in order to make the narrative make sense for cinema. I will then be doing my best at limiting the criticism towards these issues, which touch upon what I'm calling condensing the events. So, the movie begins with Lin Jieshu, played by Bao Guan, being dispatched to Guangzhou, known also as Canton by Westerners, by the Emperor to fix the opium crisis. The opening scenes do a good job of explaining what the opium crisis is to the audience and why there's such a dire need to stop the illicit trade from continuing. The audience is given a brief look at the conviction of Lin Jieshu to rid his country of opium. However, I would be remiss for not bringing up one critical flaw. Lin Jieshu's background is summed up as being the viceroy of Hujiang in the film. Lin Jieshu, however, historically was the governor general of Hunan and Hubei prior to the appointment in Guangzhou, and it was in those two provinces where he launched a large-scale suppression campaign against the trading of opium. Why am I making a big fuss about this? This is because Lin Jieshu was basically one of the only successful people of his day to suppress the illicit trade, and he had a reputation as an incorruptible man and was very well respected. He was nicknamed Blue Sky because it was said that he was to be as pure as the unblemished and cloudless sky. This information should have been mentioned because Lin Jieshu somewhat lacks a rationale for his conviction in the film. The film portrays him very well, but as you see as an audience, you do tend to wonder, why is this man chosen for the job out of a sea of corrupt officials, and where does his conviction really come from? It's not explained so well in the movie, I find. Anyways, Lin Jieshu is sent on his merry way by the Emperor, and now we are introduced to a British trader named Denton, played by Bob Peck. Yes, that is Muldoon from Jurassic Park. Clever girl. The character Denton is based off the real historical Lancelot Dent, who was an opium trader in Guangzhou. The character's portrayal is very well done and really gives you a sense of who these private merchant smugglers were. However, as I will mention later, as a result of the condensing of events, Denton and other historical characters are sort of mixed up into a bundle, and in the case of Denton, he seems to be taking the place of other prominent figures of the day, such as Jardin and Matheson. So after we meet Denton, we are introduced to a variety of characters, such as his daughter, Mary Denton, played by Emma Griffiths, and He Jingrong, played by Xi Honglong. He Jingrong acts as a middleman character for most of the film, often used as a translator between the Chinese and Western officials. His life experience is also used to showcase the struggle of commoner Chinese and the rationale for why so many Chinese merchants got involved in the illicit opium trade. I really must commend the film for its portrayal of both sides in the illicit trade. The film goes into great detail and length on the realpolitik. It is quite unbiased and does not sugarcoat the greed and corruption of both Western and Chinese merchants and officials. It did this quite well. The film did its best to showcase the events that led up to the war. Lin Zexu is shown mercilessly rounding up corrupt Chinese officials and merchants within Guangzhou in his hunt to find opium dealers and get rid of the illicit trade. Denton and the cast of Westerner traders are shown to be worried about the appointment of Lin Zexu, and they bicker as to what to do about the situation within the 13 Western Factory District of Guangzhou. Another Chinese official is introduced eventually, Qishan, played by Lin Liankun. He is portrayed somewhat as an antagonist to Lin Zexu, which makes sense for the film, although historically this is actually quite messy. Lin Zexu eventually figures out it is Denton and a group of Westerners who are the big dealers, and he sieges the 13 factories while banning the opium trade under penalty of death. This results in a hostage situation, and the Westerners are confronted with a dire decision: give up the stocks of opium or die. We are eventually introduced to Captain Charles Elliott, played by Simon Williams, who comes to Guangzhou during the hostage situation to help save the British and other Western merchants. Captain Charles Elliott does the same famous thing he did in the real history, and that is to demand all the merchants' opium be confiscated to him, while promising that Britain will reimburse everyone. The film dedicates an entire scene explaining this important historical moment, as it is largely the reason for the Opium War. That being the fact that Elliott promised Britain would reimburse these merchants, and he had no authority to do so. Britain was not going to pay the enormous amount of reimbursement, and thus the messy situation arose. It is here that we see another condensing moment. Elliott gets all the merchants on board with his confiscation idea, but then proceeds to tell our friend Denton he plans to cause a war by handing over the opium to Lin Zexu, who would then destroy it, which technically means Lin Zexu was destroying British property. Elliott then explains his brilliant plan, which is to cause the war and demand that China pays for the reimbursement. I am okay with the way the film portrays this because it does make a lot of sense cinematically. In reality, it was actually a prominent figure in Parliament who ingeniously came up with this idea to make China simply pay for the war that they were causing, but Elliott seems to represent multiple people in this film. For the audience, it simply works out, and I understand why they did it. Anyways, Elliott sends Denton back to Britain to help push Parliament to start a war in order to save the British hostages who are now trapped aboard their boats on the Chinese coast. Back in Britain, we see Parliament debating hotly over the situation in China. Half the room seems to want to go to war over the situation, while the other side is against using military force. It is very well done and captures the real event loosely. Of course, this part was also very much condensed for the film. I don't think they wanted to bore the audience too much with British Parliament. It is at this point in the movie where Denton makes a grand speech showcasing Chinese vases to stir up Parliament to go to war. Even if it does not remotely match the actual history, it does a good job of showing the audience how the debate was a hot one and how British merchants influenced the outcome, that being going to war. Back in China, we see the debate between Lin Zexu and Qishan over how to best deal with the British. Lin Zexu stands firmly by his aggressive decisions, while Qishan calls for more leniency towards the Westerners. Lin Zexu then proceeds to take the confiscated opium that Charles Elliott handed over to him and destroys it publicly. The emperor declares the opium crisis over as 22,000 chests of opium are dumped into water enclosures and destroyed. It's a fantastic cinematic spectacle that really provides the audience with the gravity of the situation. Qishan increasingly advocates for allowing the British to continue the trade, as he believes they will go to war over this. Lin Zexu, however, believes otherwise, and the movie pitches over to Charles Elliott and the Western hostages aboard their ships. We see the British hostages in despair, hoping that their country's military will come to save them, and at last the British Armada shows up to do so. We then get a very cheeky diplomatic scene over a British ship. We are introduced to Commodore James Bremmer, played by Oliver Cotton, who alongside Charles Elliott acts as the voice of British military. The diplomatic exchange is quite comedic, which shows a stern-faced Bremmer being very blunt with the Chinese official who is procrastinating and trying to bide time. Bremmer eventually makes a show of force by shooting a cannon at a local Chinese fortification and demands a yes or no answer to Britain's demands of China. This scene does quite a good job of explaining the culture shock between East and West. The British translator has a line reading, "They're always like this. This is so typically Chinese. They never say yes, they never say no." This was an excellent way of describing the ideological differences between West and East during the film. The Chinese had a diplomatic ploy where they would procrastinate rather than negotiate in order to bide time enough so that things would smooth over. For the British, everything was in absolutes. They demanded concrete answers and terms. This clash of cultures occurs a few times in the film, and I will credit the filmmakers on doing a damn good job trying to portray the significance to its audience. It's a very complicated part of the history between East and West. So the Chinese official is forced to make a choice, and that is to fight, even though he states himself it is hopeless. The battle that takes place is the historic Battle of Qinghai, though again, because of the condensing, it's really a number of battles shoved into one. Just to give an example of condensing historic battles in film, let's take a look at the film Alexander. 3 extremely famous battles, the Battle of Granicus, the Battle of Issus, and the Battle of Gaugamela, are all shoved into one battle in the film. This was done to make cinematic sense, and because of the crunch time of the film. The first Opium War consists of tons of battles, and for the purpose of cinema, it had to be condensed. It goes without saying, you should not criticize historic films for doing these condensing things. It's honestly the only way to make the movie work sometimes. So, the Battle of Qinghai it's very well done, and I feel here's good points to talk about how great a job they did with the costume work. From the redcoats to the Qing forces, you get a vibrant taste of what it was like back then. The emperor and the court officials are all displayed in excellent ways, and it shows a significant role of color in the clothing, particularly for the Qing Dynasty. The only thing I would have to criticize about the battle scenes are the lack of matchlock rifles and muskets in the hands of the Chinese. The film does not outright say they had no guns, but as an audience member, you are given the impression that the Chinese for some reason only have cannons and there's no guns, which is absolutely not the case historically. Almost every scene seems to show a Qing warrior with a spear or a sword, which of course they would have had for melee exchange, but really they should have been using very outdated matchlock rifles. The real history was that there was a technological disparity between Britain and China for guns and cannons. The Chinese had extremely outdated weaponry. The movie does show one of the largest issues during the Opium Wars, that being outdated Chinese cannons that could do not much to aim at ships. Also, special little note, the Chinese are shown killing some British soldiers during the battles in the film, which I honestly have to say is a little bit more accurate than a lot of the source material I've read, which indicates that the British almost never lose a man in almost all their battles. And when they do lose men, it's usually environmental factors or accidents and never because of the Chinese, which is interesting. Anyways, the British devastate Qinghai, and the Qing general slits his own throat, which really did happen historically. The scene gives a real sense of despair and gravity for the Qing forces. We then proceed for a long time with exchanges between Elliott and Bremmer, and Qishan and the Emperor, who now is being told gradually about the ongoings of the war by Qishan and other Qing court officials. It is here where the movie makes an egregious error, and there is a rationale for this. The audience is presented with multiple scenes where the emperor is informed of things going terribly for the military. The emphasis is that the Qing are losing battles and the British are closing in on the capital. However, the real history is that the emperor was lied to the entire war by his officials, who would tell him that things were going quite well. In reality, the emperor was completely ignorant of the Western world and had no idea the war was going so horribly until it was far too late and completely unsalvageable. The reason the film does the opposite is because it would have made absolutely no sense to the audience. It would be contradictory, and the average audience would have been very confused about the historical events being portrayed. I understand this rationale, but I feel given a few more added scenes, they could have portrayed it the way the real history was, to show the audience that the corrupt officials were more responsible for the catastrophe than were led on in the film. Regardless, during this back and forth, we get a sense of how Lin Jieshu has been fired for failing to stop the illicit trade and bringing war to China. Qi Shan is taking his place more and more, which is somewhat true of the real history, although Qi Shan is basically portraying three different figures in one. Yes, another condensing moment I keep bringing up. Anyways, Qi Shan gets to become the new official diplomat and goes on to speak with Bremmer and Elliott for some rather hilarious exchanges. Qi Shan is meeting Bremmer and Elliott in a tent, and we first get to see this hilarious scene with a fork and knife exchange and disapproval of the food by Qi Shan. This leads Bremmer to state that if the Chinese spent more time making better cannons rather than perfecting their culinary skills, perhaps the British would be begging for a truce, and not the other way around. The two sides begin talking, and the British make their terms very clear. They want reparation money for the confiscated opium, reparation for the war debts, and they want Hong Kong. Qi Shan is very troubled by all of this, and he tries to procrastinate as much as he can, which goes horribly as the British set deadlines for their attacks. It's fairly accurate of the real events, although obviously the negotiations took weeks and not simply 5 minutes. Qi Shan tries to explain to them that the emperor needed to be told their demands in increments, or else he would never, agree to any of them. This again is an excellent way of the film trying to explain the West versus East cultural dilemma, and I found it was done quite well. The British are at extreme odds with all of this, and they're as blunt as ever, wanting their yes or no answers. But Qi Shan is always trying to prolong and gaslight them. Qi Shan then offers them food and women, and states that they are guests of the Qing Empire, so the British give him another month, which was, a cute exchange. However, Bremmer ends all of this conversation with a harsh stance on Hong Kong, and Qi Shan now seems to understand that there's no more playing around. So, we then fast forward a bit, and we get another hilariously comical scene where the British claim Hong Kong for themselves. Then we skip back to Qi Shan with the Emperor and the court scrambling to come to a decision. Qi Shan pleads to not lead things to war, again with the other side advocating for military action, bringing up Lin Jieshu's position on the matter even though he's been fired. Qi Shan's position is basically to give up Hong Kong in order to save the empire, which is somewhat accurate to the real historical events. But the matter at hand was not just Hong Kong. In reality, the British were trying to forcefully open many ports of trade. And anyways, the anti-Qi Shan court group advocates that if they give up a single piece of territory, that will set a precedent for further territorial losses. The emperor then gives in to military action. Here is where we get the second and last battle of the film, basically a condensed account of many battles into one. The battle starts off with the British ships devastating the Chinese coastline forts with their cannons. We get a brief conversation between Bremmer and Elliott where Bremmer asks why the Chinese fight even without guns. Again, the film is trying to emphasize the Chinese lacking matchlock rifles and muskets. I don't know why they chose to do this. I think it was a grave error. The Chinese, of course, had matchlocks and muskets. However, they were, extremely outdated by almost 100 plus years. It is during this battle that one of the most important factors to the outcome of the Opium War is explained. The issue with the Chinese cannons against the British ones. Similar to the gun problem, the Chinese had extremely outdated cannons. In this one scene, the commander asks, "What is wrong with your cannon?" And the response by the soldier is that our cannon cannot reach the British warships. This was the case for this battle in particular, but for the real history, it should be noted that it was not the distance the Chinese cannons could fire that was the most important issue. The fact was that these outdated cannons were welded to the ground and they could not pivot or aim properly, and it was a grave issue for the Chinese. There's numerous reports that the Chinese coastline forts would shoot over the masts of the British ships, who would just, come right in and destroy the forts, basically never being hit once. Charles Elliott himself was reportedly sitting on deck in a hammock while a bombardment was occurring right over his head. And I have to say, I would have put that in this movie because that's extremely British and hilarious. We get a scene with a single Qing warrior suicidally attacking the Redcoats with a sword to emphasize more this lack of guns again. The way he is shot on the ground really seems like they were trying to symbolize this issue. but it's bizarre. I'm not sure why they would portray a lack of guns for the Chinese again. We then get a very interesting end to the battle, with the old commander setting up a suicidal attack as the British are approaching him. He waves them to come closer as he ignites a powder keg under himself to take out as many of them as possible. Why is this interesting? This is because I read from a primary source that during one battle the British received quite a few casualties, but they stated it was not because of the Chinese. They wrote that a powder cache went off accidentally and killed their soldiers. There is an irony to this because the British reports during the war were always indicating 0 to very little casualties, and whenever they would occur, they would usually be summed up by some external cause not related to Chinese actions, such as illness, dehydration, accidents, and so forth. I really like the fact that the movie made this specific scene because I think it raises the issue of false primary source reporting. The British obviously lost more men than they admitted to Chinese actions, and this honestly was simply 19th century propaganda when they were reporting these things. Anyways, so in the last part of the film, we have Qishan and Lin Jieshu receiving punishment together for their failures. The narrative is not lost on the audience. Both men had different approaches, yet they both failed. There is a sad reunion of both men in exile where they express their shame to another before parting. Qishan expresses his anguish, noting that Lin Jieshu will be honored in history, while he will remain dishonored. The ominous prophecy said by Lin Jieshu that China is being torn into a long, dark night and will have nowhere to turn for help is really forbearing for the history and the future death of the Qing Dynasty. The end of the film gives information as to the outcome of the First Opium War and the signing of the Treaty of Nanking. The audience is presented with a very symbolic show of the emperor and his children lined up crying and bowing in front of pictures of all the previous emperors of the Qing Dynasty. The camera ends with a small child sleeping almost dead-like, which I honestly believe is symbolic for the Qing Dynasty is getting weaker and weaker and weaker until it finally is dead. So overall, I think they did a pretty good job with the historicity of the film. It was not easy to summarize over 3 years of war into one film, added alongside major other historical events and elements. The portrayal of the people, places, and events is very well done, and I have little grief over, anything aside from a few historic changes, but again, it's understandable for cinema. I would note, however, that it really is a film for those interested in history. It can be a little bit dry and boring, and there are only 2 battles in the entire film. The rest is almost only pure back and forth exchanges between characters. I recommend this film to anyone interested in 19th century China, or generally interested in the First Opium War, of course. Perhaps also for those who are interested in 19th century British history as well. You do get a good sense of how Parliament was. It was pretty good for that. Certainly for Westerners, the First Opium War is probably a very obscure subject, and the film does a decent job of portraying how it went down. I really hoped you liked this review of the Opium War by Zijin. Perhaps I will tackle some other films soon. I already have one in mind, which is on the Taiping Rebellion, so stay tuned. This has been the Pacific War Channel, over and out.